Railroad mortgage bonds. A railroad bond is an obligation of a railroad company, usually secured by mortgage upon railroad property, which runs for a certain length of time at a certain rate of interest. It is apparent from this definition that the price of a railroad bond, as distinction from its value, is affected by two accidental conditions quite apart from the five determining qualities described in the preceding chapter. These accidental conditions are the length of time that the bond has to run and the rate of interest that it bears. To understand clearly the influence of these accidental conditions is a matter of the utmost importance. It is evident, for instance, that a 5% 50-year bond based on a given security will sell at a widely different price from a 3.5% 20-year bond based on the same security. Yet, the only difference is in the accidental conditions which are under the control of the board of directors. In order to eliminate these accidental features from the situation, it is customary for bond dealers to classify bonds purely on the basis of their yield or net income return. As a thorough understanding of this point is essential to an accurate judgment of bond values, whether railroad bonds or otherwise, it must be developed in detail, even at the risk of carrying the reader over familiar ground. If a bond sells above par, it does not yield its purchaser a net return as great as the rate of interest which the bond bears for two reasons. First, because the loss in principal represented by the premium which the purchaser pays must be distributed over the number of years which the bond has to run, and operates to reduce the rate of interest which the holder receives, and secondly, because the rate is paid only on the par value of the bond instead of on the actual money invested. Thus, if a 6% bond with 8 years to run sells at 110 3/4, it will yield only 4.40%, which means that if the holder spends more than $48.73 or 4.40% of $1,107.50 out of the $60 which he receives annually, he is spending the excess out of principal and not out of income. Conversely, if a bond sells below par, it yields more than the rate of interest which the bond bears. These yields have been calculated with the utmost exactness for all bonds paying from 2% to 7% and running from 6 months to 100 years, so that it is only necessary to turn to the tables to discover what will be the net return upon a given bond and at a given price. This net return is generally known as the basis, and bonds are spoken of as selling upon a 3.80% basis or a 4.65% basis, or whatever the figure may be, with no reference whatever to the price or to the rate of interest which the bond bears. Indeed, so exclusively is the basis considered by bond dealers that very often bonds are bought and sold upon a basis price, and the actual figures at which the bonds change hands are not determined until after the transaction is concluded. It is not expected, of course, that the average businessman will purchase bonds in quite as scientific a way as this. But it is essential that he should understand that while the intrinsic value of a bond is determined only by the 5 general factors described, its money value or price is affected also by these two accidental conditions. Expressed in other words, he must realize that the general factor described as rate of income does not mean the coupon rate of interest which the bond bears, but the scientific basis derived by elimination of the accidental features. Within the past year, there has been a good deal of uninformed comment about the safety of railroad bonds. Before the era of popular agitation and governmental antagonism, railroad bonds enjoyed a large measure of public confidence. But it cannot be denied that some part of this confidence has been shaken as a result of the recent exposures. Even clear-headed men have exaggerated the importance of the developments, and too often railroad officials, who should have insisted upon the soundness and stability of their properties, when they elected to talk for publication, have given way instead to dismal and unwarranted forebodings. There is no mystery involved in determining the safety of railroad bonds. Any man of business experience, keeping in mind the general principle which measures the value of all obligations, can easily determine, with the aid of two documents, the degree of safety which attaches to any particular railroad bond. The general principle to be observed is that the safety of any obligation depends upon the margin of security in excess to the amount of the loan, and the two documents to be consulted are the mortgage of trust indenture securing the bonds, which describe the property mortgage, and the last annual report of the railroad, which shows its financial condition. Confining the analysis for the present to mortgage bonds upon the general mileage of a railroad, the following points should be considered. First, rate per mile at which the bond is issued. Applying the general principle indicated above, it must be learned what proportion the bonded debt of a railroad bears to the total market value of the property. It is much easier to make this comparison on a per mile basis. In determining whether the rate per mile is excessive, reference must be made not so much to the particular bond in question as to the total bonded debt per mile of the railroad, and to the relation which that figure bears to the total market value of the property per mile. The total market value per mile is obtained by adding the market value of the stock per mile to the par value of the bonded debt per mile. A single issue of bonds varies all the way from $5,000 to $100,000 per mile, according to the location of the railroad. Total capitalization per mile, stocks and bonds at par, varies in about the same proportion, from $35,000 to $300,000. The average for all the railroads of the United States is $67,936 per mile. The actual cost of the railroad, as shown by the balance sheet, must be taken into consideration, and also the estimated cost of duplicating the property. Fiscal difficulties of construction must be weighed, for a railroad through a flat, sandy country should not be bonded for as much. Other things being equal, as a railroad through a mountainous country, where much cutting, filling, and bridging are required. The section of country in which the railroad is located must be considered, for $35,000 per mile on a single track line in a poor country may be higher than $300,000 per mile on a 4-track trunk line which owns valuable terminals and rights of way through several large cities. Second, amount of prior lien bonds outstanding per mile. The amount of bonds which come ahead of the bond in question on the same mileage is a matter of great importance and works directly against the security of the bond. Purchasing a bond which is preceded by a prior line bond is like taking a real estate mortgage on property already encumbered. If the bond is not followed by other bonds, then the margin of security in the property is represented wholly by the market value of the stock per mile, and the investor must figure carefully the value of this equity. Third, amount of junior lien bonds outstanding per mile. The amount of bonds which come after the bond in question, on the other hand, works directly in favor of the bond, for it increases the margin of security. It shows also that other people have had sufficient confidence in the property to invest their money in obligations subject to the one in question. In the event of a receivership, this is often a matter of great importance. For if a foreclosure sale is ordered, the junior bondholders, in order to protect their own interest, must buy in the property for an amount at least equal to the par value of the prior lien bonds. The foregoing considerations apply particularly to the safety of the principal invested in railroad bonds. The following points affect the safety of interest. Fourth, gross earnings per mile. The gross earnings of a railroad must be compared with those of other roads occupying the same field, and the returns for a number of years must be examined to determine whether such earnings have increased or decreased. The position in which the railroad stands for obtaining new traffic must be noted. This is dependent somewhat upon the railroad's ability to take traffic from other railroads, but more upon the probable growth and development of the territory which the railroad serves and the increased traffic which will probably be offered. In this connection, the rate of increase in population in the road's territory is important. The proportion between passenger and freight earnings, the diversity and density of freight traffic, and passenger and freight rates should be examined. The reputation of the management for ability and integrity should be considered. Gross earnings run from about $3,000 to $40,000 per mile, with the average being $10,460. Fifth, net income per mile. Net income is obtained by subtracting from gross earnings operating expenses and sometimes taxes, and adding to the net earnings so obtained whatever income from other sources the railroad may derive. This is a very important figure. As with gross earnings, the reports should be examined to determine whether net income is on the increase or the decrease, and it should be compared with the net income of other railroads occupying the same field. It involves a criticism of operating expenses. The payments of the railroad must be analyzed to determine whether the proper sums have been expended for maintenance of way, replenishment of rolling stock, and other improvements sufficient to keep the road in good physical condition. Normally speaking, operating expenses should absorb about 65% of gross earnings. If it is found that a railroad operates for 60%, however, it does not always follow that its operating officials are exceptionally efficient, so that the cost of conducting transportation is relatively small. It may mean that the physical condition of the property is being neglected, or that ordinary improvements which should be charged to maintenance are being paid for by increase in capitalization. It is very important for the investor to find out which is the case. If analysis leads to the suspicion that the earnings result from neglecting the property or capitalizing every trivial improvement, the railroad's bonds should be rejected. Net income varies from $1,500 to $12,000 per mile, with an average